Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today at City Club's April 28th Friday Forum. I'm Sharon Van Sickle-Robbins, President of City Club, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here with us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB and KBPS radio or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today, our speaker, Wayne Pacelle, will discuss why decency to animals is a vital building block of a civil society. But we'll start with a few announcements. First off, if you haven't already done so, please make sure your cell phones are silenced. Next, I'd like to recognize one of our new City Club members. Jennifer Anderholt is a counseling psychology student, and if you'll stand up, we'd like to welcome you here today. We're at the tail end of City Club's spring membership drive. If you become a City Club member during today's Friday Forum, you'll receive $25 off the first-time member fee. In addition, you'll receive a coupon for a free Friday Forum lunch to use anytime you choose throughout the next year. You can sign up using the forms that are on your table or those at the back of the room. There really is no better time to join. I'd like to thank all of our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and I'd also like to offer our sincere appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors who make these luncheons possible. Please join me in offering our sincere appreciation to this quarter's sponsors, communications firm Morel Inc., who's here with us today, the utility company Northwest Natural, and the law firms of Perkins Coie and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. We really thank you for your support. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club offices. And now to today's program. Animals play a central role in the human story, and how we interact with them is one of its greatest themes. From our first barefoot steps as hunters and gatherers, through the age of domestication and animal sacrifice, to the modern era of pampered pets and industrialized agriculture. Today we're at an odd moment in that story and in our relationship with other creatures. Some see more love and fascination with animals than ever before, manifest in widespread pet ownership and wildlife watching. But others assert that there is cruelty and exploitation on a vast scale, with enterprises like factory farming of animals and the black market wildlife trade resulting in suffering and death to millions of creatures every year. Today, Wayne Pacelle, President and CEO of the Humane Society of the United States, will argue that a conscious concern for animals is a necessary feature of our moral progression and our economic success. Wayne has served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Humane Society of the United States since 2004. Under his leadership, the Humane Society has experienced significant growth and is now the nation's largest animal protection organization. They have 11 million members and constituents and provide direct services for more animals than any other organization in the United States. In addition to his work at the Humane Society, he is the founder of Humane USA, the nonpartisan political arm of the animal protection movement, and the founder of the Humane Society Legislative Fund, a social welfare organization that lobbies for animal welfare legislation. Through these organizations and the Humane Society, today's speaker has played a central role in more than 25 successful statewide ballot measure campaigns. He most recently led the effort to pass Proposition B in Missouri, which is the first statewide ballot measure addressing the problem of cruelty at puppy mills. An experienced writer, he is the author of a newly published book, The Bond, Our Kinship with Animals, Our Call to Defend Them. And now please help me welcome today's speaker, Wayne Pacelle.
Thanks very, very much for that very nice introduction, and thanks all of you for coming today. I really do appreciate it. I have been very excited to come to the City Club of Portland, and I've heard about its legendary influence, but even I was surprised that the leaders of the club In the last few weeks, they called the royal family and had them move the wedding time for Prince William and Kate Middleton to early this morning so it wouldn't conflict with our program today. But I am really glad to be here, and I know we've got some wonderful people here who are supporting this community in so many ways, and obviously I can't take time to recognize all of them and thank them, but a few of the voices for animals here. I know that we've got some folks on the board at the Oregon Humane Society, and I'm really grateful to all of them for your service to the community and to this great organization. Deborah Wood is here, the director of the Bonnie Hayes Small Animal Shelter in Washington County. Mike Oswald, the director of Multnomah County Animal Services, is here as well. And Aaron Asmus with the cat adoption team. I just want to thank all of you for your outstanding work in the community. And I'm sure there are many others here associated with your groups, and I want to thank you and honor your work. You know, I did write this book recently. It just came out earlier this month, called The Bond. And I called it The Bond because I believe that we have built into us a natural connection to other creatures. I don't think it's just the province of a few people. I don't think it's an overly sentimental concern of those of us who are really attuned to animals. I do believe that, as our introducer said, it really spans the entire arc of the human experience. We have always been connected to animals. If you go back to the days of hunters and gatherers and today's tribal communities that are studied by anthropologists, or the information we glean, they have an intimate knowledge of all of the animals in their ecosystems and communities. They know the behaviors of the animals. And animals are killed, of course, in hunting and gathering communities, but there are rituals of atonement, there are apologies offered. And what is so interesting to me is that in these tribal societies, these non-agricultural societies, there is widespread pet keeping. Wild animals are kept in these communities as pets. And we see it in Brazil, we see it in New Guinea, we see it all over the world. And of course, you know, in our modern day, we have so many manifestations of this connection that exists, all of this social behavior to show that we're connected to animals. 2/3 of American households have pets. We have 171 million dogs and cats in our homes. There are another 150 million pets of other types in our homes. So there are actually more pets than people in the United States. We spend more than $50 billion a year now on our pets, whether it's veterinary services or pet food or other toys or services for these animals. We are also a nation of wildlife watchers. We appreciate the beauty of the natural world and all of the creatures within it. 70 million of us take to the forests and the fields, or we take to whale watching boats every year, and we spend another $50 billion on those activities every year. So again, it seems to me, and it's always seemed to me, that our connection with animals nourishes us. It's a tonic to us. We're a social creature. We need interactions with others in order to feel complete and whole. The worst thing you can do to someone in prison is to put him or her in solitary confinement. A person goes mad in that setting. But when we interact with others, we feel better. We need it. And when we interact with animals, we feel better as well. And there is even more and more evidence to suggest that there is some biochemistry to the bond between us and animals. There's a hormone common to mammals called oxytocin. And this is a hormone that plays an important role in women's reproduction, in inducing lactation, and a number of other aspects of our own reproduction as a species. But it also is viewed and seen as a social bonding hormone. It connects the mother to the child and allows the mother to stare at the baby for 12 hours a day. I mean, if we didn't have these hormones in us that induce social bonding, these other behaviors, we would not have the social relationships that we have. And, you know, a lot of us immediately understand that we have hormones that induce sexual attraction. We have hormones that stimulate a fear response in us. And there's more and more evidence to show that our biochemistry is leading us to these social relationships as well. And I think, again, what it does for me is it partly explains what's going on in terms of all this behavior. And you know, more and more there's evidence to show that animals have rehabilitative effects on us. You know, when our veterans come back from Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world where they're serving our country, and they have clinical effects of their experiences, whether it's post-traumatic stress disorder or some other affliction, when they get an animal, whether it's a therapy dog or just a companion animal, we see that they are able to get off their medications in many respects. They're able to sleep better at night. They're able to leave their home and integrate themselves back into society. We know that dogs and other animals are taken to senior centers or to hospitals, and a smile washes over the faces of so many of the people who have these interactions. And I think that there is really something to this in terms of our history and our present circumstance with animals that draws us to it. And of course, as we live more in cities and we live more in suburbia, we crave these interactions more. You know, in our nation in the 19th century, when more and more people moved from agrarian settings to the newly emerging cities, that was when the rise of pet keeping really occurred and became a middle class sensibility, not just a custom of the elite or the most wealthy in society. And it's just been progressing and progressing and progressing, with pet keeping becoming such a normalized sort of experience for us. And you know, in our society, we have so many other manifestations of our interest in animals. There are 10,000 animal welfare groups and wildlife protection groups in the United States alone. I mean, there's a mountain lion protection group. I mean, every species has its defenders. There's a snow leopard foundation. There's, of course, many feral cat groups. There are wolf protection organizations. And you have groups that are organized to defend categories of animals like farm animals or laboratory animals. Even animals like guinea pigs have their own defense organizations. And we fund a rabbit sanctuary in South Carolina, and our motto for the rabbit sanctuary, which takes in homeless and injured rabbits, is we provide hope for the hopless. And you know, every creature has its defenders, and that is a wonderful thing. This bond connects us. You know, I think there have been a number of wake-up moments on this bond between us and animals, but I think one of the biggest was the nation's response to what went on in the harrowing weeks after Katrina struck in 2005 in Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. Of course, there were 1,800 people who perished in that terrible calamity, calamity that threatened one of the great American cities, New Orleans. And people, in addition to so much suffering right at the moment, they lost their homes. They didn't know if they would ever get back to their community or their communities because the swath was so large. And it was an amazing response from the nation to help the people who were afflicted. And the American Red Cross and the Salvation Army and other humanitarian organizations poured in there to help people, and the government responded as well. And a few days later, we began to see the images of some of the animals, because when a disaster strikes, I mean, any living creature is going to be a victim, whether it's the human or non-humans. And we began to see, you know, a dog peering out of an empty home, or we saw a cat clinging to a rooftop in a flooded city. And then we saw, you know, piece by piece, heroic efforts on the part of so many people to help and rescue these animals. And when I was down there, in the wake of this, and perhaps some of you were down there as well, you know, I really expected from so many of the reporters I spoke to hear this question, you know, with all of the human suffering going on, you know, why are you concerned about the animals? But not a single interviewer who was down there in Louisiana and Mississippi asked me that question during the many weeks I'd been down there. Because everyone who was there saw that suffering was suffering, that whether it was humans or animals, there were just victims. And all of the efforts that were made to help whatever creature was suffering were welcomed and warranted, and those people were heroic, no matter whether they were helping a child or a dog or a cat or whatever creature. And I just want to recount just a very brief reading from my book, on this issue. One of the scenes that I found very moving myself. This is from the opening chapter of my book, The Bond, and the chapter is called For the Love of Pets. In a lifetime of being around animals, I'd seen some strange and interesting things, but here was something completely different. I was standing in the front galley of a Continental Airlines 727 that was soon to depart Baton Rouge Airport, surveying a plane packed with passengers, all of them dogs. It was like something from a Far Side cartoon, complete with chipper flight attendants serving dog biscuits and water. Given the desperate circumstances, everyone was quiet and well-behaved, and the sound of the captain's voice had ears up and heads tilted. Not one of the 140 dogs on board was barking or whining, not even the ones stuck in the middle seats. There was something comical in the scene, but also deeply touching, seeing all these frightened faces wondering what was happening to them. Yet, however afraid they might have felt at the moment, every one of them was lucky to be leaving New Orleans in the days after Hurricane Katrina. These guys had already been through a lot. They'd been abandoned when the city was evacuated, left to fend for themselves as the waters rose, their food ran out, and they found themselves all alone in an empty house. When finally they heard a friendly voice, it wasn't their owners, but one of the hundreds of rescuers who had come to help. Now they were bound for California, where others would take them in until one day soon, if everything worked out, their owners would find them and take them back home. What mattered most right now was to get them to safety and worry about the reunions later. And you know, I just think it was a moment when we began as a nation to understand that this bond is so powerful, that so many of the people who stayed behind and tried to brave the storm did so because they didn't have a place to take their animals. The shelters that had been set up to take evacuees wouldn't take dogs or cats, and people just wouldn't abandon them. So many people would not abandon them. And then, of course, once the rescuers came to help these people in crisis, the rescuers had no instructions on taking the animals. And they reached out a helping hand to people who were truly in distress. And so many of them said, thanks for coming for me, but I'm not going to abandon my best friends during their time of desperation and need and crisis. And you know, we work to turn this into national legislation to account for pets and disasters. The late Senator Ted Stevens we worked with to shepherd through that legislation. And 20 states, including Oregon, also passed legislation to include pets in disaster planning. And that was an important moment in our understanding of this human-animal bond. But you know, I'm struck by all of this goodness in our society for animals, and I'm also struck by the fact that we've settled the debate in some fundamental way. You know, every state, including Oregon, has an anti-cruelty statute that forbids malicious or gratuitous cruelty to animals. And just 2 days ago, Mississippi became the 47th state to adopt felony-level penalties for malicious acts of animal cruelty. Just 3 states remain. But dogfighting is specifically a felony in all 50 states. Cockfighting, we just banned it in the last redoubt of cockfighting in 2008 in Louisiana. So the basic argument is already established in the law. And it's an accepted moral position that cruelty is not acceptable. The difficulty for us in our society is applying this principle in a world where animal use is everywhere. It's part of our food production system, it's part of science, it's part of some of our recreational activities. And how we navigate this relationship is so critically important to us because we are at this incredible moment of contradiction in our relationship to animals. There's more goodness and decency for animals than ever before. There are more social interactions between us and animals than ever before. But there's also more cruelty on a greater scale than our world has ever seen. There are 10 billion animals raised for food. And many of them, most of them, are raised on factory farms, where there has been, over the last 50 or 60 years, a mass migration, a forced migration of animals from outdoor settings where animals could feel sunlight on their backs or soil beneath their feet. They had access to the outdoors, and they could, live a decent life. They could behave like animals. They could interact with one another, they could walk around, they could run around. And we've changed agriculture. We have moved animals into these big warehouses, at least some of them, not so much the cattle industry, but the pig industry and the chicken industry, certainly the egg-laying hen industry. And we've put these animals in warehouses. We've genetically manipulated them to exaggerate many of their commercially valuable body parts or reproductive capabilities. And then within these big warehouses, we cram them in side by side, sometimes in cages and crates barely larger than their bodies. So veal calves are put in a 22-inch wide crate that doesn't allow the young male calf to even turn around for the short 16 or 20 weeks that he's alive. It's even worse for the breeding sows in the pig industry. They spend up to 3 years in a 2-foot by 7-foot cage that is just a cage that immobilizes them entirely. And at the end of their reproductive life, after 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 successive pregnancies, then they're sent off to slaughter. Or the issue of laying hens. I mean, the issue of laying hens is truly incredible, what we've done to these birds. We have now jammed them into small cages called battery cages. And there are 6 or 8 birds are jammed in this cage, and in each cage, the bird has about 67 square inches. I'm back. Each bird has 67 square inches of space. Now this 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, which I just stole from you, I'll give it back. This is 93 square inches of space. So if you do a fold here on 1/3, you're left with about 67 square inches. That's the living space that laying hens have for a 1.5 or 2 years that they're alive. Now, I don't care if you're a vegan or a vegetarian or you're an inveterate carnivore and you eat, animal products 3 times a day. This sort of treatment where animals have this allotment of space is not decent. It is not merciful. It is not consistent with our responsibilities to other creatures. And we can certainly do better than this. And just this past Monday, we filed language with a large coalition of organizations in the state to push the industry towards a cage-free approach to raising these birds. Now, there are large industrial-type cage-free operations. They're big buildings. It doesn't guarantee nirvana for birds, but at the very least, they can stand up, they can flap their wings, they can move around. They're not going to be stacked, 8 stacks high in these buildings with 150,000 birds in a single building or a complex with millions of birds at each facility. And we're going to be gathering signatures on that. We're disappointed that the legislature is not handling this issue in the way that we had hoped. The egg industry knows it must change because in California we passed a ballot measure in 2008 to stop this extreme confinement of laying hens, and it got more votes than any citizen initiative in California history. The industry knows it must change, but unfortunately, their effort is to increase the space requirement just a tick, and then to give the industry until 2026 to provide this slight increase in space. Now that is, it's movement in the right direction, but it is not nearly fast enough. It is riddled with loopholes. It's too inadequate to account for the needs of these animals. But this issue of industrial farming is one that we must confront as individuals and as a society. If we are concerned about animals, if these principles of opposition to cruelty mean something in the real world, we've got to think about what's going on. And factory farming is an incredible innovation. I mean, I think of it in some ways as a remarkable expression of human creativity, but one divorced from conscience. I mean, it is efficient. It is almost, unimaginable that you could have these buildings that I've been in with so many animals and even keep them alive. But I think that what we need to do as a society in general, and what we've been doing in our society for a long time, is trying to sync up our commerce and our economic activities with our values. You know, we have a nation that is founded on some pretty important and enduring values and ideals. I mean, in the 18th century, the founders of this country talked about liberty and equality, and they talked about fairness and justice, and our Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. And those things mean something. I mean, it drives our civil society. And we had to wrestle with the activities that we were engaging in that are inconsistent with those principles. Of course, we had chattel slavery in the 18th century and until 1865 in the 19th century. But there was a great social struggle that was engaged to end slavery. And unfortunately, it had to culminate with a terrible civil war that claimed more than 500,000 lives of young men. But that issue had to be dealt with, because you can't have a society grounded on the principles of decency and fairness and all of these other enduring principles and then have chattel slavery. And you can't have a democracy and disenfranchise half the people. I mean, it took us until 1920 as a nation to provide women's suffrage. I mean, giving the right to vote to half the population is a pretty important element of democracy. And I think that if we're true and serious about these principles in our society, and I know that we are, I know I am, and I know so many of you are, then we've got to not suspend these principles when it comes to the treatment and care of animals. We've got to exhibit fairness and mercy and decency. You know, I don't talk about animal rights at the Humane Society of the United States. I talk about human responsibility. It is more about us than it is about them. I mean, yes, there is a basic framework at work here. We've got to understand animals. We've got to know that they have feelings, that they can suffer, that they have a wide range of emotions. We used to deny that as a species. You know, a whole science of behaviorism kind of taught us that animals were just completely operating by instinct, that they were endlessly pursuing mating opportunities and feeding opportunities, and everything they did was governed by instinct, as if they were just some pre-programmed kind of package of animal life. And we know from our own common sense experiences with our own pets and interacting with other animals that they have personalities, they are surprising, they make choices, they experience joy and happiness, and they feel sadness and loneliness. I mean, these are living beings, and they have the same wish to avoid suffering and pain that we do. So if you accept that premise, and I think anyone who is conscious and aware does, then it imposes upon us some responsibilities to act in a way that befits our humanity. I mean, we have all the power in the relationship over animals. We can crush them, we can destroy them, we can wipe them out. We proved that a long time ago. I mean, go back to the history of our country and look what we did in the 19th century, where in the span of 3 decades, in the Great Plains of the North American continent, we dropped buffalo numbers from more than 40 million to just 500 animals in the span of just, you know, my own, less than the period I've been alive. I mean, 30 years. Amazing. With the new technologies that we developed and the transportation mechanisms, we completely wiped out the passenger pigeons. There were billions of passenger pigeons in North America in the 19th century. The last one died in a captive setting at the turn of the 20th century. I mean, we proved a long time ago that we could do whatever we want to animals. And I think that the way that we treat other beings is a basic test of our character. We can choose the path of exploitation and harm and destruction, or we can choose the path of mercy and kindness and decency, recognizing that we have responsibilities to other creatures. And you know, what I call for in my book is a new humane economy. That economy that syncs up our values with our economic institutions. I mean, when you divorce them, when you separate them, then you get things like slavery, or you get something like child labor. But when you marry them together, you get something wonderful and beautiful. And you get business enterprises working for the good and betterment of our society, which is what we need in a capitalist economy. You know, I think of the trips that I've taken, and I take the reader and the bond to many different places. In one place I take the readers up to the ice floes of Canada, where you have a miracle of nature playing out every spring. 6 million seals come down from Greenland, down the Atlantic coast of Canada, and they give birth on the vast ice floes to the east of the North American continent. And the mothers are pregnant, and they give birth to these beautiful white-coated baby seals. The mother's pelts are of no value at all, but the white-coated seals, even with a little speckling on them, are still valued in a few parts of the world for fur. And as I fly over this area, these ice sheets, you know, you look down out of the helicopter, peering out, and you begin to see a few little spots on the ice. And those are the first signs of seals. And then as you fly over another 10 minutes or 15 minutes out to the east, you see larger groups of seals, and then more and more seals. And there are millions of seals. And the mothers, and then you land, and then you're amidst these seals. And it is a once-in-a-lifetime experience to see all these creatures. And the mothers are with the babies for just 12 days. They produce a high-fat, nutrient-rich substance that the babies gorge on, and then they leave. And the babies can't swim for a few weeks still. And they can't run, of course, because they don't have legs. And men in boats come with clubs and guns, and they start to slaughter the animals. I mean, just going after them one by one. Some of the little babies rear up a little bit and make a plaintive cry, and the men club them and shoot them. And then they peel off the fur and leave the carcass out on the ice, or they throw the carcass into the water. And the quota this year, which they're not going to meet, fortunately, because we've been closing markets all over the world to seal pelt imports. The United States doesn't allow it. Nobody uses these pelts in Canada. The European Union a year and a half ago banned it in all 27 nations. Mexico outlaws it. And the government of Canada essentially uses all of its diplomatic powers to try to open small little markets all over the world for these pelts. I mean, it's an amazing thing that the government spends perhaps $10 million a year promoting, defending this hunt, when last year it generated $1 million in gross revenue, because the value of the pelts is so diminished because so few people in the world want it. If the whole thing were allowed to rise or fall on free market principles alone, it would be done right now, because it's an enormous money loser when you factor in all of the costs for it. But it continues because of stubborn refusal and because of local politics in Canada. And when I'm up there, seeing the contrasting images of the beauty and the grandeur of nature and this miracle on the ice, and then I also see the men doing this killing and slaughtering, I think, you know, that is the old economy. That those people are not representing what the world thinks about. I mean, these people are grabbing and running and killing and leaving a bloody trail in their wake. And how many people are interested in that? I mean, is it a tiny little fraction of 0.1% of the people interested in killing seals and wearing their pelts? But how many of us, if we had an opportunity to engage in ecotourism, to go see these seals, would be interested in doing that? I mean, wouldn't that so far eclipse, in terms of the economic opportunity and the economic potential, the exercise that they're now engaging in, which of course is incompatible with wildlife tourism, is you can't have these two things going on at the same time. And you know, you look at our nation and you think of, you know, we used to be the biggest whaling nation in the world, but now the whaling ships have all been deconstructed. And now in their place we have new ships that carry people who love whales to watch them and see them, the humpback whales and the gray whales and the fin whales and the minke whales and so many of these incredible creatures in the sea. I mean, that's the new humane economy. I mean, this is the humane economy that we can have a humane and sustainable agricultural economy. We can have humane science and move away from animal testing, especially as we innovate and find new methods of testing that don't require us to kill or use animals and create distress and pain for them. It involves wildlife-based tourism. I mean, the government of Kenya stopped sport hunting, trophy hunting of animals in 1977 and now generates hundreds of millions of dollars in tourism to watch the great elephant herds and the wildebeest herds and the zebras and the giraffes and the lions and the Cape buffalo. Because it just makes sense. There are just a few people who believe in those things, but the vast majority of us, based on our pet keeping and our wildlife watching, we want to appreciate animals. So when we sync it all together, that's how you grow the economy, and you also honor your values. And you know, it's up to us as individuals to think about these issues and not leave it up to someone else. You know, I think of a lot of characters in my book, and one character is a guy named Chuck Anderson. And Chuck Anderson, he was out swimming in the Gulf of Mexico one day and having a good time swimming, and suddenly a bull shark came at him and attacked him. And before he knew it, severed 4 of his fingers on one of his hands. The bull shark made another run at him. Chuck parried it. He made a 3rd run at Chuck, and this time bit him on the other arm and severed his arm just below the elbow. Now, if there's any person you would think would have reason to hate animals, or certainly hate members of one species, it would be a person who had a very bitter experience with an individual creature and lost part of an arm and lost 4 of his fingers. Chuck survived that attack, fortunately, and oddly enough, a couple years ago, he and 8 other victims of shark attacks went to Capitol Hill not to urge lawmakers in Congress to eliminate protections for sharks, but actually to advocate for them. And sharks are not the cuddliest of all animals out there, so when you factor that in, and Chuck and his group of people who hadn't known each other before someone assembled them together to do this, advocated for an end to shark finning, the practice of catching sharks, hauling them on board, cutting off their dorsal fin, and then throwing the living body back into the water to die a miserable death, all to make shark fin soup, which is consumed in certain communities in the United States and in China and in a few other Asian countries. Now today, the Oregon State House passed a bill to ban possessing shark fins. It made it a crime to do so. Washington has a similar bill. We're working on a similar bill in California to end this practice, because 73 million sharks, it's estimated, are killed globally a year for shark fin soup. Now, to think of the issue here, to think of all of the suffering that these animals go through, the catching, the hauling up on board, thrown into the air, the severing of their most important external body part, their dorsal fin, and then to be thrown alive, versus someone having an ingredient in their soup which can be easily substituted for. I mean, the contrast in terms of the little tiny course correction that we make to spare 73 million animals this suffering versus what they go through. I mean, I think of this with fur coats. You know, it was a past necessity. Today, at best, it is a minor convenience. I mean, we have beautiful synthetic coats, we have natural fiber coats. The creativity of designers and manufacturers and retailers has solved this practical problem. I mean, we have plenty of other options. It's now just a question of, are we going to make the right choice? Are we going to choose to act in a way that is dismissive or really immoral toward animals? Or are we going to try to be a conscious consumer and think about these issues? And you know, it's so important for us to make the right choices when it comes to animals in our own lives. And I know those of you who labor so hard with local humane organizations, you're urging people not to go to a pet store, or urging them not to buy an animal from an internet site, and please support, a local rescue group like the Pixie Project, or go to the Oregon Humane Society, or go to the Animal Services operations in Multnomah or Washington County. I mean, these people are laboring all day, and they're seeing the consequences of people's poor decision-making. Here's an easy choice. I mean, the dogs that you get from these places are well socialized in almost every case. They're vaccinated. I can tell you, we raid puppy mills all the time. I mean, those animals are often inbred. They've got genetic and hereditary problems. They're not getting any veterinary attention. They are in bad shape. They're not well socialized animals in general. I mean, the idea that the $2,000 animal in a pet store window is superior to an animal in a shelter, that is just false. I mean, that is completely false, and I've been in both, and I can tell you from personal experience, and I know that those of you who are familiar with know that. And I think we need to think about our food choices. I mean, we are just not consumers who just do whatever we want without respect to these larger issues. When we've got 10 billion animals caught up in this food production system, I mean, we have to start to make choices. I mean, the only reason that it exists this way is because we, as consumers, have allowed it to get this bad. We've become so separated from our food supply that we are willing to allow these things to happen. And, it's either denial or just kind of I don't want to deal with it. And I understand it. I mean, it's difficult to change, and we don't want to confront some tough things from time to time. But if you care about animals, and I know so many people in our society do so deeply, we've got to begin to think about this. And we've got options. I mean, whether you are, a vegan or, as I said, an inveterate carnivore, I mean, we all have choices. You can procure products from farmers who are raising animals in a more humane way, or you can, opt for vegetarian items. I mean, imagine if we as a society just reduced our consumption of animals by 10%. I mean, just in general, 1 out of every 10 days you decide you're not going to eat meat, keep everything the same the rest of the 9 days. Well, what's 10% of 10 billion? That's 1 billion. We would save 1 billion animals a year just by making that little course correction in our lives. And I think that, the whole notion that sometimes our critics offer is that we've got to do things just the way that they've been doing them, as if our world is static. And I'm reminded of a story on that. And a story is that a few years ago, I think it was 2007 or 2008, in Alaska, there was a meeting of the International Whaling Commission. And at the IWC, they set the rules on whaling in the world. And there's a quota that's given to some native communities to kill some bowhead whales, which are an endangered whale species. And these Inuit hunters get to kill a couple of bowheads. And this community in Alaska killed a bowhead whale. And they were, after harpooning the whale, the community was dragging the whale up onto the shore. And as they began to carve up the whale, a 55-foot bowhead whale weighed 50 tons, I mean, larger than any dinosaur that ever lived on the planet. They found that they were not the first people to have hunted this whale, and that embedded in the flesh of the whale was a portion of a bomb lance that had last been used before 1890. So this whale, killed in 2007 or 2008, had been hunted sometime in the 1860s or 1870s, had survived the attack, passed the entire 20th century apparently without other incident, lived to be perhaps 130 years old. We've only more recently realized that whales can live 150 or 175 years of age. And at some level, you think of this story and you think how sad it is that this whale died. But I think also about how much the world has changed in the lifespan of a single animal. That in the 1860s, we just saw the first stirrings of this humane sensibility in America after the Civil War ended. The first groups like the ASPCA or the Oregon Humane Society and other local groups around the country were formed to advance this notion that we should be responsible and good to other creatures. And now, at the end of that whale's lifetime, we have 10,000 organizations that exist to help animals. We have even more innovations and advances in science that give us a way forward through these problems. And we have such potential now that we have such a body of law in Oregon and other states and internationally to advance animal welfare even more meaningfully. I think it's a moral responsibility that we have as individuals and as a society to be better to these other creatures, because it's part of our humanity how we handle this question. The word humane has at its root human. It's about us. Thank you very much.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host, City Club Governor Mac Prichard. Mac is the founder and president of Prichard Communications, a public relations and social media firm that serves foundations, nonprofits, and public agencies across the country. Mac joined the City Club in 2004, served on the Agri Committee for 2 years, and joined the Board of Governors last year. Mac?
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks, Wayne, for those thoughtful remarks. Part of your organization's mission includes protection of marine animals, and here in the Pacific Northwest at the Bonneville Dam and now the Willamette Falls Dam here just south of Portland, we've seen groups of sea lions gather, and they're attracted by the salmon that are going up and down the fish, using the fish ladders at those dams. And now fishermen have asked the Oregon legislature for changes in the law that would, in the Willamette Falls, allow state employees to use weapons to distract the animals and drive them away. And there's a bill before the legislature to do that. There's also another bill that would open the door for euthanasia of sea lions in Oregon. I wonder if you had the opportunity to testify to the Oregon legislature about those two pieces of legislation, what advice you might give them.
Well, you start me off with a tough one. You know, I think that a lot of the choices that we face in our lives with animals are pretty easy. I mean, it's a very clear pathway to do the right thing. When you have a situation like this, where you have two competing, moral imperatives, essentially. I mean, I know what an important role salmon have played in the culture of all the peoples of the Northwest, especially. And their numbers have been decimated through a lot of our human activities. Damming, in particular, has had a devastating impact on the salmon runs. And of course, with marine mammals, we passed a law in this country in 1972 to protect marine mammals because so many of them had been destroyed and killed for fur and for other purposes. So you really have competing imperatives, and I do think that in general, we don't have a view at HSUS that we want a complete hands-off approach to these conflicts that exist between species. So I think the efforts to actively manage this situation and to manage the sea lions in a way through non-lethal harassment techniques is a way to give the salmon a better chance in their runs. And I know that one of the bills is offered to expand those opportunities. The broader issue, I think, cannot be divorced from the sea lions. I think it's very easy for us to point a finger at the sea lions because we physically see them at the Bonneville Dam and at Willamette. And I think that the data show that the sea lions take about 3% of the run at the mouth of the Columbia, whereas sport fishermen take 16, and the dams obviously are the ultimate cause of much of the problem. So I fear, frankly, scapegoating the sea lions. And I do not want a passive approach. I think we should do our best, but I think killing the sea lions is not going to work. And other sea lions would come in and fill that gap if they were removed. and I just don't think it's a lasting solution to the problem. But it's a tough one. It's a very tough one. Oh, yes.
We're now going to turn to questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forum is a privilege of City Club membership, so please identify yourself as a City Club member before asking your question, and remember to keep it to 30 seconds so I don't have to pull my question mark on you.
Leslie Moorhead, City Club member and Secretary of the Board of Governors. Could you comment on what you think are reasonable regulations regarding pet ownership? People do love their pets. I certainly agree with you on that. But sometimes, in particularly densely populated areas, it can become problematic. And I'm thinking of animals like pit bulls or people keeping large numbers of cats in their homes. And then the interest that's very big out here is keeping small farm animals, or what we would consider farm animals, in backyards, such as chickens and goats and beehives and so on. So can you give us examples of regulations in a city setting that you think are reasonable regulations, and maybe an example of what you think is an unreasonable regulation?
Well, a great question, and thanks for framing it as you did, because every issue has its own dynamics and its own challenges. Just take the issue of chickens in our backyards, for instance. I mean, we historically have been quite critical of people gathering a bunch of roosters in their backyards, because to us, we have seen so many people have roosters for cockfighting for those purposes. And it is not a small matter. I mean, it's tens of thousands of operations all over the United States. At the same time, I mean, I really support people who want to have chickens on their property for egg production and for kind of taking control of your food supply and not just leaving it up to somebody else. I mean, the more touches we have with our food supply, I think the better in that way. So I think that needs to be carefully done. You know, one of the problems, of course, with roosters is they're crowing, and they start, you know, first thing in the morning, and that can be very disruptive to people. So definitely we support, and we worked, Kelly Peterson, who is our Vice President for State Affairs, who's been our Oregon leader for many years. She helped shepherd legislation through in the state legislature to ban possession of roosters for fighting purposes. But just quickly on the pit bulls, I mean, there's so many different aspects of this. We don't support breed-specific legislation in the sense of banning the ownership of a breed. When I was a kid, German Shepherds were involved in a high number of attacks on people because that was the dog du jour. And they were the ones that people who wanted a tough dog and who wanted kind of an attack mentality, they gravitated to those animals. Then it was Doberman Pinschers, and then it was Rottweilers, and now we're in the mode of pit bulls, who are the most exploited of all types of dogs. I mean, they're not really a breed. They're a bunch of different breeds that make up this categories of pit bull. As a practical matter, there is no way to responsibly enforce a pit bull prohibition. I mean, if the dog has a quarter pit bull, I mean, what is pit bull anyway? So I think we need dangerous dog ordinances to really crack down on the people who are causing the problem. We obviously need strong anti-dog fighting statutes and ban on possession of animals for fighting. There are a lot of other issues, exotic pets that people keep. I mean, we supported legislation that was passed also with Kelly's leadership on this in Oregon to ban people keeping lions, bears, tigers, alligators, crocodiles, and other dangerous animals as pets. People were keeping them in their backyards or their basements, which is madness on so many levels, and it was an important advance at the statewide level. And I'm not sure what your rules are here in Multnomah County and in the other 35 or so counties in Oregon.
David Margulis, City Club member. You've listed so many different issues. I was curious, which is right now the most important single issue you're fighting is the first part of my question. And secondly, when you take on the entire animal industry of all the food products made with animals, who's your biggest adversary or opponent when it comes to the lobbies of different animal producers for food?
Well, you know, asking which issue is the toughest is kind of like, you know, asking you which of your children is the most problematic, you know, in some ways. It's a tough issue. And I'll tell you that HSUS focuses on, we do so much in so many realms, but we do concentrate a lot of energy on factory farming, cracking down on puppy mills and ending euthanasia of healthy and treatable animals as a composite, ending the seal hunt and other killing of animals for fur, ending animal fighting and other malicious forms of animal cruelty and working to get felony-level penalties for cruelty and then seeing those laws enforced. And then protecting wildlife in a whole bunch of realms, stopping the trade in wildlife parts like ivory or rhino horn or hawksbill shell turtle, stopping particularly inhumane practices in the hunting field like captive hunts or canned hunts, or hound hunting of bears or cougars, which we worked on here in the mid-1990s, which continues to be an issue here in Oregon. We also did ban the captive hunts by working with the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission a few years ago and just got a very important ruling to validate that law. I would say of all of the issues, and of course marine mammals and some of that are a big focus of ours, the issue that I think is the biggest contributor to suffering is factory farming because of the raw numbers of animals. And it's also one that we can turn around with our daily choices and think through. And that's one of the reasons why we filed this ballot measure here in Oregon, is to address that issue with the 2.5 million laying hens in confinement here in the state. I think that every issue has its own dynamics, and you know, we're really supportive of people who want to work on so many subjects, and we have gathered so many experts at HSUS. I'm trying to think of the adversaries. You know, there are a lot of them. The American Farm Bureau Federation, I tag in my book, The Bond, as being an impediment to change on some of these agriculture issues. The pork producers, the United Egg Producers, a number of others are adversaries and are posing a real challenge because they want deregulation. They don't want standards of care that are set by law. Yes, one more? Okay.
Chris Andre, City Club member. The factory farms seem to be, to me, one of the central areas of concern. Could this be handled somewhat the way we might handle oil? We don't factor in the true costs of that as the military to defend it. But if the price of meat went up, would we be able and was allowed to rise to what its real level is to reflect the real costs of producing it? Is there a way to enforce environmental regulations that might cause that to happen? Has anyone worked in that area that you know of, and how would that strategy work?
Well, I think it's, again, a really, really important question. And kind of like the seal hunt, you know, when I argued that the economics really don't argue for it when you factor in the true costs, if you take out the government subsidies, the whole thing is a net loser. You know, when we buy meat or eggs or dairy products at the counter, we are paying the market costs, but we are not necessarily paying for the true costs. In my book, I note that 22% of all U.S. farm income comes from the government. There are a variety of subsidies. There are support programs for a variety of products. There are direct payments. There are cyclical payments, counter-cyclical payments. There is emergency payments. There are all sorts of payments that come into this incredible social safety net that exists for agriculture. And the thing is, it's really benefiting the biggest producers, and there's been a big fight in Congress on this. There are so many other costs in agriculture that are not factored at the checkout register. The environmental costs of aggregating so many animals on these factory farms and then dumping the waste untreated. I mean, the waste that we produce as 310 million Americans is treated. We have systems in our communities to treat that waste. The 100 million pigs slaughtered, untreated. The 9 billion chickens, untreated. The 35 million cows, untreated. And the volume of waste so far exceeds the human quantity of it. Where is it going? So we have clean air problems, we have clean water problems. We also have public health costs. On these factory farms, in many of the sectors of the industry, the animals are living in such a fundamentally unhealthy environment that antibiotics are put in the food or in the water in order to prevent disease as a prophylactic. I mean, when we take antibiotics, if we're sick, we're supposed to do it only if we're sick, and you're supposed to run through the course of the antibiotic treatment. But we're providing 70%, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, of antibiotics in this country to farm animals who are not sick, but who may be sick because they're in these fundamentally unhealthy environments. So when you really factor the animal cruelty costs, the environmental costs, the public health costs, as well as the costs in terms of our own diets, I think the case is unbelievably overwhelming that what we're doing is bad public policy. So again, I want to thank all of you so much for coming today. Great to be with you, and look forward to seeing you again, and I hope some of you will think about picking up the book and delving in deeper. Thank you.
We have run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for today. Join us next week when Elizabeth Harchenko, former director of Oregon's Department of Revenue, attempts to answer the question, do we have more government than we can afford? As we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation again to today's guest, Wayne Pacelle. We're adjourned.